The secure phone rang at exactly 3:47 a.m. On the other end, a voice I'd only heard in classified briefings spoke my code name, a name that had taken me 15 years to earn. As I grabbed my gear and headed for the door, I could still hear my father's words echoing from dinner just hours earlier. "Sarah, all those languages are just a waste of time. When are you going to get a real job? I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." He was about to find out exactly what my real job was. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I speak 8 languages fluently. But growing up in the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, that wasn't exactly considered a superpower. In fact, to my father, Frank Mitchell, it was quite the opposite. Frank ran Mitchell's hardware store on Main Street, the same store his father had run, and his father before him. To him, success was measured in concrete things: inventory sold, cash in the register, customers who knew your name. He built his life on practical, tangible work, and he expected his only daughter to follow a similar path. But I was different. While other kids in Millbrook were playing video games or hanging out at the local diner, I was hunched over language textbooks, completely captivated by the way different cultures expressed the same human experiences through entirely different sounds and structures. It started with Spanish in middle school, then French in high school. But I didn't stop there. During my junior year, I discovered that our local community college offered night classes in German. I convinced my part-time job supervisor at the grocery store to adjust my schedule so I could attend. My father wasn't pleased about the arrangement, but he tolerated it, assuming it was just another phase I'd grow out of. I didn't grow out of it. Instead, I grew deeper into it. By the time I graduated high school, I was already working on my 4th language, Mandarin Chinese. I'd found online tutors, language exchange partners, and every resource I could get my hands on. My bedroom walls were covered with conjugation charts, vocabulary lists, and cultural notes written in scripts that looked like art to most people in our town. "Sarah's got her head in the clouds again," my father would tell anyone who asked about my studies. "All this foreign language nonsense. What's she going to do with Chinese in Ohio? We don't even have a Chinese restaurant here." The criticism stung, but it also fueled something inside me. Every time he dismissed my passion, I dove deeper into my studies. I added Russian during my freshman year at Ohio State University, where I'd earned a partial scholarship. Japanese came next, followed by Arabic, and finally Portuguese. Each new language felt like unlocking a secret door to an entirely different way of seeing the world. My father's disapproval grew with each new language I mastered. During my college years, our phone conversations became increasingly tense. He'd ask about my grades, which were excellent, but then immediately pivot to questioning what I planned to do with all this language stuff. "You know, Sarah, your cousin Jessica just got promoted to assistant manager at the bank," he'd say. "She's making real money now, buying a house. Meanwhile, you're over there learning, what is it now, Arabic? What are you going to do, move to the desert?" The comments hurt more than I let on. Part of me wondered if he was right. What was I going to do with 8 languages in a world that seemed to value more conventional skills? My classmates were studying business, engineering, and computer science, fields with clear career paths and obvious applications. I was studying the subtle differences between formal and informal address in Korean, while they were learning about profit margins and algorithms. But something kept pushing me forward. Every time I achieved fluency in a new language, I felt like I'd gained access to a new version of humanity. I could read poetry in its original form, understand news from different perspectives, and connect with people across cultural boundaries that seemed impossible to bridge in English alone. During my senior year at Ohio State, I made a decision that would change everything. I applied for a government internship program that I'd heard about through one of my linguistics professors. The application process was unlike anything I'd experienced: extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and interviews that seemed to probe every aspect of my character and capabilities. When I received the acceptance letter, it came with instructions that were both exciting and mysterious. I was to report to a facility in Virginia for a 12-week training program. The details were deliberately vague, but the clearance level required suggested this was serious government work. I decided not to tell my father about the specifics. I simply said I'd gotten an internship with a government agency in Washington, D.C. His response was predictably dismissive. Government work, huh? Well, I suppose that's steady. Though I still don't see how speaking Chinese is going to help you file paperwork or whatever it is they do in those offices. The training facility turned out to be nothing like filing paperwork. Hidden behind layers of security clearances and non-disclosure agreements, I discovered a world where my language skills weren't just useful, they were essential. I was being trained as a linguistic intelligence specialist, someone who could intercept, translate, and analyze communications in multiple languages for national security purposes. For the first time in my life, my passion had found its perfect application. I wasn't just translating words. I was identifying threats, uncovering plots, and providing intelligence that could save lives. The cultural nuances I'd spent years studying suddenly became crucial tools for understanding the subtle implications behind seemingly innocent communications. My supervisor, Director Patricia Coleman, was a 20-year veteran of the intelligence community who spoke 6 languages herself. During one of our early training sessions, she explained why people like me were so valuable. Sarah, most people think translation is about converting words from one language to another, she said. But what we do here is about understanding context, subtext, and cultural implications that could mean the difference between preventing an attack and missing critical intelligence. I threw myself into the training with an intensity that surprised even me. The work was challenging, mentally exhausting, and absolutely fascinating. I learned to identify regional dialects that could pinpoint someone's location, recognize code words hidden in ordinary conversations, and spot linguistic patterns that revealed organizational structures within target groups. When the internship ended, I was offered a full-time position. The salary was more than my father made at the hardware store, but I couldn't tell him about most aspects of my work. As far as he knew, I was a government translator working on routine international communications. His reaction was typical. Well, I suppose it's better than being unemployed. Though I still think you could have saved yourself a lot of trouble by learning something more practical. But if they're paying you to read foreign newspapers or whatever, at least you're earning money with all that studying. For the next 3 years, I built a reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could handle the most complex linguistic challenges. I worked on cases involving international terrorism, cybersecurity threats, and diplomatic intelligence. My colleagues knew me by my codename, Cypher7. The codename reflected both my security clearance level and my ability to decode linguistic puzzles that stumped other analysts. When communications came in that required someone who could understand not just the literal meaning but the cultural and political implications behind specific word choices, they called for Cypher7. But my father still saw me as his impractical daughter who'd gotten lucky with a government job. During our weekly phone calls, he'd update me on the practical successes of my high school classmates, who was getting married, buying houses, or taking over family businesses, while treating my work as an expensive hobby that happened to pay bills. You know, Sarah, I ran into Tom Bradley at the hardware store yesterday, he'd say. Remember him? He was in your class. He just bought the old Peterson farm and is turning it into a wedding venue. Real entrepreneurial spirit. Making something tangible that people can see and use. The implication was always clear. My work was abstract, invisible, and therefore less valuable than something you could touch or visit on weekends. 3 months ago, everything changed. I was assigned to a case that would test every skill I'd developed and push my linguistic abilities to their absolute limits. Intelligence agencies had intercepted communications suggesting a coordinated attack on multiple American targets. But the messages were scattered across 8 different languages and used cultural references so specific that they required someone with deep understanding of each linguistic tradition. I spent weeks analyzing the communications, identifying patterns that crossed language barriers, and piecing together a timeline that revealed a sophisticated plot. The work required not just translation skills, but an understanding of how different cultures approach time, hierarchy, and coded communication. When I finally cracked the pattern and identified the targets, dates, and methodology, my analysis landed on the desk of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The threat was real, immediate, and required rapid response from the highest levels of American military leadership. That's when my phone rang at 3:47 a.m. with a call that would change my relationship with my father forever. The voice on the secure line belonged to General Rebecca Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'd never spoken to her directly, but her reputation preceded her. 30 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and a mind sharp enough to navigate the most complex geopolitical situations. Cipher 7, we need you at the Pentagon immediately. Full tactical briefing in 90 minutes. This is Priority Alpha. Priority Alpha meant one thing: imminent threat to American lives. I'd only heard those words twice in my 3-year career, and both times had resulted in preventing catastrophes that the public would never know about. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Within 20 minutes, I was in my car, heading toward Washington. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 6 hours earlier, I'd been sitting at my childhood dinner table in Millbrook, listening to my father explain why my career was basically just expensive hobby work. I'd driven home for what I thought would be a quiet weekend visit. My father had insisted on cooking his famous pot roast, and for a brief moment, I'd allowed myself to imagine telling him the truth about my work. But when he started his usual lecture about practicality and real-world applications, I'd bitten my tongue and nodded politely. "Sarah, I love you, but you've got to face reality," he'd said while carving the roast. "Speaking foreign languages is fine as a hobby, but you're 28 years old. Your cousin Amy just made partner at her law firm. Mike Henderson bought his second dealership. These are people doing things that matter in the real world." I'd wanted to tell him about the terrorist cell I'd helped dismantle in Frankfurt by recognizing dialect patterns in their Arabic communications. I'd wanted to explain how my Portuguese skills had helped prevent a cyber attack on American infrastructure by understanding coded messages hidden in Brazilian social media posts. But my security clearance meant those stories would remain forever locked away. Instead, I'd smiled and said, "I'm doing fine, Dad, really." Now, racing through the Virginia darkness toward the Pentagon, I wondered if this case might finally bridge the gap between my secret world and his understanding. The Pentagon briefing room was already packed when I arrived. General Hayes stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by officials I recognized from intelligence briefings, people whose decisions shaped global security. The wall screens displayed maps, communication intercepts, and threat assessments in multiple languages. "Cipher 7, thank you for responding so quickly," General Hayes said as I took my seat. "What I'm about to show you represents the most sophisticated multilingual intelligence operation we've encountered in the past decade." The first screen showed communication intercepts in Arabic, but as I scanned the text, something felt wrong. The grammar structures were correct, but the cultural references seemed off. Like someone with excellent technical knowledge but limited cultural understanding had composed them. These messages were intercepted from known terrorist networks, continued Colonel Marcus Webb, the briefing officer. Our standard Arabic translation team has provided literal translations, but we suspect there are deeper layers of meaning we're missing. I studied the Arabic text more carefully. "Sir, may I see the metadata on these communications? Timestamps, location data, anything that might indicate the sender's background?" Of course. New information appeared on the screen. That's when I saw it. The messages weren't just in Arabic. They were in a specific dialect of Levantine Arabic, but with subtle word choices that suggested the sender had learned the language formally rather than growing up with it. More importantly, embedded within the Arabic text were loan words from Mandarin Chinese that would be meaningless to most Arabic speakers but carried specific significance in certain regional contexts. "General, these messages aren't just multilingual. They're designed to be understood only by someone with knowledge of both Arabic and Chinese linguistic traditions. The sender is using Chinese grammatical concepts translated into Arabic sentence structures." General Hayes leaned forward. "Explain." I moved to the whiteboard and began breaking down the linguistic patterns. In Mandarin, context and timing carry more meaning than direct statements. The sender is using Arabic words but structuring the information flow according to Chinese communication patterns. They're essentially speaking Chinese through Arabic vocabulary. The room was silent as I continued the analysis. The second screen revealed communications in Russian, but with similar anomalies. Hidden within the Cyrillic text were Japanese honorific concepts that created additional layers of meaning. They're not just using multiple languages, I explained. They're creating a hybrid communication system that requires deep cultural knowledge of all 8 languages to fully decode. Someone would need to understand not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural thought patterns behind each language. General Hayes exchanged glances with her staff. How many people in the world could create such a system? I considered the question carefully. To design this level of linguistic complexity? Maybe 12, possibly 15 people globally. To decode it completely? Even fewer. That's when Colonel Webb revealed the true scope of the threat. We believe this communication system is being used to coordinate simultaneous attacks on American soil. We have fragments in 8 different languages, all using this hybrid encoding method. Our individual language experts can translate pieces, but nobody has been able to connect the full pattern. The weight of the situation settled over me. This wasn't just about translation. It was about preventing a coordinated attack that could cost thousands of lives. And I might be the only person in American intelligence with the specific combination of linguistic skills needed to crack their code. I'll need access to all intercepted communications, cultural context databases for each language, and a secure workspace, I said. How much time do we have? Intelligence suggests the coordinated action is planned for 72 hours from now, General Hayes replied. But given the complexity of their communication system, we suspect final instructions will come in the next 24 hours. I spent the next 18 hours in a secure facility, surrounded by screens displaying communications in Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, German, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Each message seemed innocuous on its own, but together they formed a complex puzzle that required understanding not just words, but cultural contexts, historical references, and linguistic traditions. The breakthrough came at 2:15 a.m. on my second day of analysis. I'd been staring at a Portuguese message that seemed to be discussing a family reunion, when I realized the family members being mentioned weren't people. They were code names for different attack teams, and the reunion activities were target locations described using cultural metaphors that would be meaningless to anyone without deep knowledge of Portuguese colonial history. Once I understood the Portuguese pattern, the other languages began falling into place. The Arabic messages used Islamic historical references to indicate timing. The Chinese communications used classical poetry references to describe methodology. The Russian text employed Soviet-era cultural touchstones to designate team roles. By dawn, I had assembled a complete picture, 8 coordinated attacks planned for major American infrastructure targets, with teams positioned in different cities, all waiting for final activation codes that would be transmitted using this impossibly complex multilingual system. I presented my findings to General Hayes at 6:30 a.m. The targets included power grids, transportation hubs, and communication centers across the country. The sophistication of the plot was staggering, but now that we understood their communication system, we could intercept their final instructions and coordinate our response. Cipher 7, General Hayes said after reviewing my analysis, you may have just prevented the largest coordinated attack on American soil since September 11th. This intelligence will allow us to position our response teams and intercept their communications in real time. As I sat in that Pentagon briefing room, surrounded by the highest levels of American military leadership, I thought about my father's words from just 48 hours earlier. All those languages he considered a waste of time had just potentially saved thousands of lives. But the most surreal part was still ahead of me. Because in 12 hours, I had to drive back to Millbrook for what I thought would be another quiet Sunday dinner, where my father would probably ask again when I was going to find real work. I had no idea that this case was about to make that conversation impossible to avoid. Sunday dinner at the Mitchell house was supposed to be routine. My father had prepared his special barbecue ribs, and my stepmother Linda had made her famous cornbread. I'd arrived that afternoon exhausted from 36 hours of continuous intelligence work, but I couldn't show it. As far as my family knew, I'd spent the weekend at a routine government training session. We were halfway through dinner when my father launched into his latest lecture about my career choices. Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, he began, cutting into his ribs. Maybe it's time you considered transitioning into something more substantial. Linda's nephew Jake is doing really well in pharmaceutical sales. He makes 6 figures and gets to travel, but he's selling actual products that help people, not just translating things. I pushed food around my plate, trying to find a diplomatic response. After spending the last 48 hours preventing a terrorist attack that could have killed thousands of Americans, listening to my father dismiss my work as translating things felt particularly painful. Dad, I appreciate your concern, but I really am doing important work. More important than you realize. Important to who? Some bureaucrats in Washington who want to read foreign newspapers? Sarah, I'm not trying to be harsh, but let's be realistic about what actually matters in this world. That's when my secure phone rang. I'd switched it to silent mode, but the vibration was unmistakable. A call on the secure line during family time meant only one thing. The situation had escalated beyond our predictions. Excuse me, I need to take this, I said, stepping into the hallway. Cipher 7, this is Command Central. The voice belonged to Director Coleman, and her tone was urgent. We've intercepted final activation codes. The timeline has moved up. They're executing tonight instead of tomorrow. My blood ran cold. What's our response status? Teams are mobilizing now, but we need real-time translation support for intercepts. We're patching you into the command center from your location. Can you establish secure communications immediately? I glanced back toward the dining room, where I could hear my father telling Linda about Jake's latest sales achievement. Affirmative. Give me 2 minutes to set up. I rushed to my car and retrieved my emergency kit, a briefcase containing encrypted communication equipment that I'd hoped never to use during a family visit. Within minutes, I had established a secure connection to the Pentagon Command Center from my childhood bedroom. Cipher 7 online, I reported through my headset. We're receiving communications in real time, Director Coleman's voice crackled through the encrypted channel. Teams are positioned in Chicago, Atlanta, Denver, and Los Angeles. We need immediate translation as intercepts come in. For the next hour, I sat in my teenage bedroom, surrounded by old high school trophies and family photos, providing real-time linguistic intelligence to counter-terrorism teams across the country. Communications were flooding in through all 8 languages as the terrorist cells realized their plan had been compromised. The Arabic team in Chicago was trying to abort their mission, but their handler was insisting they proceed. I translated their heated argument, allowing our team to position themselves optimally for the arrests. The Chinese communications from Denver revealed a backup target they'd never mentioned before. My translation gave our team 20 minutes to evacuate civilians from a shopping center that would have been devastated. The Russian cell in Atlanta was attempting to warn the others using coded language hidden in what appeared to be a discussion about restaurant reservations. I decoded their warning system, allowing our teams to intercept communications to the remaining cells. Outstanding work, Cipher 7, came General Hayes' voice through my headset. Your translations are allowing us to stay ahead of their adaptations. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah? Who are you talking to up there? My father's voice carried up from the hallway. I muted my microphone quickly. Just a work call, Dad. I'll be down in a few minutes. But he was already at my bedroom door, and his expression changed completely when he saw my setup. The encrypted communication equipment, multiple screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds, and my headset with military-grade encryption markers were impossible to explain away as routine government work. Sarah, what the hell is all this? Before I could respond, urgent communications started flooding through my headset. The Japanese team had activated some kind of backup protocol, and their messages were coming through in rapid-fire technical language that required immediate translation. I held up a finger to my father and unmuted my microphone. Command, I'm receiving Japanese technical communications. They're discussing electronic countermeasures and mentioning something about signal interference patterns. As I translated the complex technical Japanese in real time, I could see my father's expression shifting from confusion to shock. The conversation I was having was clearly not about filing paperwork or reading foreign newspapers. They're attempting to jam our communications, I continued. The frequency patterns they're discussing suggest they have sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities we weren't aware of. General Hayes's voice came through clearly enough that my father could hear it. Cipher 7, your intelligence just prevented them from blinding our entire operation. Exceptional work. Quote, I finished the translation session 20 minutes later, confirming that all 8 terrorist cells had been successfully apprehended and their coordinated attack completely neutralized. The operation was over, but my family situation was just beginning. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, my father said slowly, using my full name like he had when I was in trouble as a child. What exactly do you do for a living? I removed my headset and began powering down the encrypted equipment. The weight of 3 years of secrecy suddenly felt unbearable. Dad, I work for the Defense Intelligence Agency. My official title is Senior Linguistic Intelligence Specialist, but my colleagues know me by a codename, Cipher 7. He sat down heavily in my old desk chair, staring at the sophisticated equipment I was packing away. Cipher 7? And that was the Pentagon you were talking to? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually, along with the command center coordinating counterterrorism operations in 4 major cities. The silence stretched between us. Downstairs, I could hear Linda cleaning up dinner, unaware that anything unusual had happened. So when you said you speak 8 languages, he began. I use all 8 languages in my work. Today I prevented a coordinated terrorist attack by translating communications that no one else in American intelligence could decode. The terrorists had created a communication system so linguistically complex that it required deep cultural knowledge of Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, German, Spanish, French, and Portuguese to understand. My father looked around my childhood bedroom, as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze lingered on the old vocabulary charts I'd never taken down, the cultural reference books still lining my shelves, and the language learning materials that had once seemed like teenage obsessions. All those years, he said quietly, when I thought you were wasting time with languages. You thought I was being impractical. I understand why. But Dad, those 8 languages you called a waste of time? Today they potentially saved thousands of American lives. He stood up slowly, processing everything he'd witnessed. And you couldn't tell me because... Security clearance? Everything I do is classified. As far as anyone in Millbrook knows, I'm just a government translator working on routine international communications. Linda's voice drifted up from downstairs. Frank? Sarah? Is everything okay up there? My father and I looked at each other, both realizing that our entire relationship was about to change. But first, we had to go downstairs and pretend that nothing extraordinary had just happened. That his daughter hadn't just helped coordinate one of the largest counterterrorism operations in recent American history from her childhood bedroom. So, he said finally, when you said you were doing important work. More important than either of us could have imagined, Dad. And it's just getting started. The next morning, I woke up to find my father sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and 3 different newspapers spread out in front of him. Linda had already left for her shift at the hospital, and the house was unusually quiet. Morning, Dad. He looked up from the papers, and I could see he hadn't slept much. Sarah, I've been reading about what happened yesterday. The news is calling it, quote, a major counterterrorism success, but they're not giving any details about how the attacks were prevented. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. The front page of the Washington Post carried the headline, Coordinated Attack on U.S. Infrastructure Thwarted by Intelligence Community. The article mentioned 8 arrests in 4 cities, but provided no specifics about the investigation methods. That's how these things work, Dad. The public gets to know that they're safe, but the details stay classified to protect future operations. He folded the newspaper carefully. But you were part of this. You were the one who figured out their code. Part of a team, yes. Intelligence work is never a solo effort. My father stood up and walked to the window overlooking his backyard. For a long moment, he just stared out at the garden he'd been tending for 30 years. Sarah, I owe you an apology, not just for yesterday, but for years of not understanding what you were building toward. I joined him at the window. Dad, you couldn't have known. I wasn't allowed to tell you. But I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing. Instead, I kept comparing you to other people, measuring your success by standards that had nothing to do with your actual work. He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not just respect, but genuine awe. When I watched you yesterday, translating those communications, coordinating with the Pentagon, that wasn't just a job, Sarah. That was mastery. Real expertise that took years to develop. The validation I'd wanted for so long felt surreal now that it was happening. Those languages you thought were impractical, each one opened doors to understanding different cultures, different ways of thinking. When I was analyzing those terrorist communications, I wasn't just translating words. I was thinking like someone from each of those linguistic traditions to understand what they really meant. My father nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that all night. How did you know to study so many languages? I mean, when you were 16 learning Chinese, did you somehow know you'd need it for this? I laughed for the first time since the whole crisis began. Dad, I had no idea this job even existed when I started learning languages. I just loved the challenge, the way each new language changed how I thought about everything. So you followed your passion, even when everyone around you, especially me, questioned whether it was practical. I followed what interested me, yes. But I also worked incredibly hard to become excellent at it. Passion without skill doesn't get you very far in intelligence work. My secure phone buzzed with a text message. Director Coleman was requesting a debrief meeting later that week to discuss potential new assignments. The message reminded me that yesterday's operation was just one case in what would likely be a long career. Dad, can I tell you something? Yesterday wasn't unusual for me. I mean, the home setting was unusual, but working on cases that complex, using all my languages to prevent serious threats, that's what I do regularly. He sat back down, processing this information. How often? Maybe twice a month, I work on something that could genuinely impact thousands of lives. Every few months, something that could affect national security on a larger scale. And you've been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of active operations, yes, but really I've been preparing for this work since I was 14 years old, learning Spanish verb conjugations. My father picked up his coffee mug, then set it down without drinking. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Last night, after everything that happened, I called your Uncle Robert. Uncle Robert was my father's younger brother, a career military officer who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The two brothers had always been close, but they rarely discussed work in detail. I told him what I'd witnessed, and he explained some things about intelligence work that I never understood. He said people with your kind of specialized skills are incredibly rare, and that the work you do probably prevents more conflicts than most people realize. This was unexpected. Uncle Robert had always been supportive of my education, but I'd never known he understood the intelligence community well enough to explain it to others. He also told me something else, my father continued. He said that in his 22 years of military service, he'd worked with maybe 3 or 4 intelligence specialists who could handle the kind of complex analysis you were doing yesterday, and none of them could work in 8 languages. I felt a flush of pride, but also a new understanding of why my father had struggled to comprehend my career path. His frame of reference had been local and practical. The hardware store, the community he knew, the immediate and visible impact of traditional work. Dad, I understand why my career seemed abstract to you. Most of what I do will never be public knowledge. I can't point to a building I helped construct or a business I helped grow. The successes are invisible, but they're real. They're very real. He was quiet for several minutes, then asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now with your work, I mean? Do you go back to Washington? I go back to my regular assignments. Yesterday's operation will lead to more investigations, more cases that require the same kinds of linguistic analysis. The terrorists we caught were part of a larger network that we'll need to understand. More dangerous situations. I considered how much to tell him. Dad, the work itself isn't physically dangerous. I'm not in the field. I'm analyzing communications, identifying patterns, providing intelligence to people who make operational decisions. My job is to understand what people are saying and what they really mean. But the stakes are always this high. Usually, yes. Though yesterday was unusually complex because of the multilingual encoding system they'd developed. My father stood up again, this time walking to the family photo wall where pictures from my childhood hung alongside more recent family gatherings. He stopped in front of my high school graduation photo. You know what I remember about your graduation speech? You talked about how learning languages had taught you that there are always multiple ways to understand any situation. I'd forgotten I'd said that. I remember writing that speech, but I don't remember you paying much attention to it. I was paying attention, I just didn't understand what you meant then. I thought you were being philosophical. Now I realize you were describing exactly the skills you'd need for your actual career. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. At 18, I'd been articulating the core principle of intelligence analysis, without even knowing such work existed. Sarah, I have one more question, and you don't have to answer if it's classified, but are you good at this? I mean, compared to other people who do this kind of work. I smiled at the directness of the question. Dad, yesterday General Hayes told me that my analysis may have prevented the largest coordinated attack on American soil since September 11th. 3 months ago, I received a commendation for work that helped dismantle an international cybercrime network. Last year, I was promoted to senior specialist 2 years ahead of the normal timeline. So you're not just good at it, you're exceptional. I work very hard to be exceptional. The consequences of mistakes in this field are too serious for anything less than excellence. My father walked back to the table and sat down across from me. Sarah, I'm proud of you. Not just for what you accomplished yesterday, but for having the vision to develop these skills when no one around you understood their value. You saw something the rest of us missed. For the first time in years, I felt like my father and I were speaking the same language, literally and figuratively. Thanks, Dad. That means more to me than you know. And from now on, when people ask me what my daughter does for a living, I'm going to tell them you're a senior intelligence specialist who protects our country using skills that took her 15 years to master. I laughed. You could just say I work for the government. Sarah, he said, grinning for the first time since the whole crisis began, I'm never going to downplay your accomplishments again, especially not the languages. 6 months after the operation that changed everything, I found myself back in Millbrook for Linda's birthday celebration. But this homecoming felt completely different from any previous visit. Walking into Mitchell's hardware store that Saturday morning, I was surprised to find my father deep in conversation with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my old high school Spanish teacher who'd been the first person to recognize my language aptitude. Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez exclaimed when she saw me, your father was just telling me about your work. I always knew those languages would take you somewhere special, but I never imagined anything quite this significant. I shot my father a questioning look. Over the past 6 months, we'd established new ground rules about discussing my career. He could acknowledge that I worked in intelligence, but operational details remained strictly off-limits. Don't worry, he said, reading my expression. I just mentioned that you use your language skills in national security work. Dr. Rodriguez was telling me about the new international studies program they're starting at the high school. Dr. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. We're hoping to expand beyond just Spanish and French. The school board finally approved funding for Mandarin and Arabic programs, partly because I kept telling them about students like you who could benefit from early exposure to diverse languages. It struck me how much had changed in my hometown's perspective on language learning. 6 months ago, my father had seen my multilingual abilities as impractical. Now he was apparently advocating for expanded language programs at the local high school. Actually, my father continued, I was wondering if you might consider speaking to some of the students about career opportunities that require language skills. Obviously nothing classified, just general information about how languages can open professional doors. This was a complete reversal from the man who'd once suggested I switch to pharmaceutical sales because it was more practical than language work. I'd be happy to speak to students, as long as we keep it general, I agreed. That afternoon, I found myself in my old high school auditorium facing about 60 students who'd signed up for what Dr. Rodriguez had advertised as a, quote, career paths in international communications presentation. How many of you are currently studying a foreign language? I asked the assembled teenagers. About half the hands went up. And how many of you have parents who think you should focus on something more practical? Nearly all the hands that had been down went up, accompanied by knowing laughter from the students. I understand that completely. When I was your age, sitting in these same seats, my father regularly suggested I focus on more realistic career goals. He wasn't trying to discourage me. He genuinely couldn't see how languages would translate into meaningful work. I spent the next hour describing various career paths that required language skills, from international business and diplomacy to journalism and technology. I talked about how cultural understanding could be just as valuable as vocabulary, and how linguistic skills often led to opportunities that didn't exist when they first started learning. The most important thing I can tell you, I concluded, is that passion combined with excellence creates possibilities you can't even imagine yet. When I started learning Chinese at 16, I had no idea what I'd eventually do with it. I just knew I loved the challenge of understanding how different cultures organize their thoughts. During the question session, a junior named Marcus asked, "But how do you know if you're actually good enough at languages to make a career out of it?" That's a great question. Proficiency isn't just about vocabulary or grammar, though those matter. It's about cultural fluency, the ability to understand not just what people are saying, but what they mean within their cultural context. If you find yourself fascinated by those subtleties, if you start noticing patterns and connections between languages, that's a strong indicator you have aptitude worth developing. A senior named Ashley raised her hand. "My parents keep asking what I'm going to do with French and German. They want me to choose a major that leads to a specific job. How do I explain that languages can be valuable even if they're not my primary career focus? Tell them that in our globalized economy, linguistic and cultural skills enhance almost every profession, but also understand their concern. They want to see a clear path to financial stability. The key is demonstrating excellence in whatever you choose while building language skills as a complementary strength." After the presentation, several students approached me with more detailed questions. Maria Gonzalez, a sophomore taking both Spanish and Mandarin, asked if she could email me about college programs that combined language study with international relations. "Absolutely," I said, handing her my business card, the public one that listed my title as Senior Communications Analyst with a government email address. "And Maria, the fact that you're already studying two very different language families suggests you have exactly the kind of analytical mind that excels in international work." Walking back to my father's store that evening, I reflected on how surreal the day had been. 6 months ago, my father had been embarrassed by my language obsession. Now he was arranging speaking engagements to showcase how valuable those skills could be. I found him closing up the store, tallying the day's receipts in his old-fashioned ledger book. "How did the presentation go?" he asked. "Really well. Those kids asked some smart questions about career planning and practical applications of language study." He finished his calculations and locked the cash register. "You know, after watching you work 6 months ago, I started paying attention to international news differently. When I see stories about tensions with China or situations in the Middle East, I think about how someone like you might be analyzing communications behind the scenes." This was new. My father had never been particularly interested in global affairs, preferring local news and sports. "It's given me a different perspective on what's happening in the world," he continued. "All these complex international situations that seem impossible to understand. There are people like you working to make sense of them." As we walked home together, he asked a question I'd been expecting for months. "Sarah, do you ever regret not choosing something more visible? Something where you could talk openly about your accomplishments?" I considered this carefully. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have work I could discuss freely. But Dad, the missions I work on, the problems I help solve, they matter in ways that most visible work doesn't. Yesterday I received a briefing about how intelligence from a case I worked on 3 months ago helped prevent a conflict that could have involved American military forces overseas. Thousands of soldiers didn't have to deploy to a dangerous situation because someone understood what certain communications really meant. But nobody will ever know about your role in that. The people who need to know, and honestly, that's enough for me. We reached the house just as Linda was lighting candles on her birthday cake. The small family celebration felt warm and comfortable in a way that visits home hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as we sat around the living room sharing cake and stories, Linda mentioned that she'd been bragging about me to her colleagues at the hospital. "Not about the classified stuff," she quickly clarified, "just about how proud we are that you found work that uses all your talents." Some of the doctors were asking about your educational background because they're interested in language learning for their own kids. My father nodded. Word's getting around town that Frank Mitchell's daughter is doing important government work with her language skills. I have to admit, I enjoy correcting people who used to think you were wasting your time in college. Enjoy correcting them how? I asked, curious about how he was handling these conversations. Well, when Tom Bradley mentioned last week that his son was struggling to choose a college major, I told him about your presentation at the high school. I said sometimes the most practical choice is to develop exceptional skills in something you're passionate about, even if the career path isn't immediately obvious. This was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. My father, who'd spent years advocating for practical, conventional career choices, was now encouraging other parents to support their children's intellectual passions. I told Tom that watching you work taught me the difference between a job and a calling. Jobs are about earning money and staying busy. Callings are about using your unique abilities to solve problems that matter. As I drove back to Washington the next morning, I thought about how much had changed in 6 months. The terrorist operation had certainly proved the value of my skills to my father, but the deeper shift was in his understanding of what constituted meaningful work. He'd learned that expertise developed over years could create opportunities that didn't exist when the learning began. He'd seen that passion, when combined with excellence, could lead to contributions that were both personally fulfilling and genuinely important. Most significantly, he'd discovered that his daughter's impractical language obsession had positioned her to protect the country he loved. That realization had transformed not just our relationship, but his entire perspective on education, career development, and the value of intellectual curiosity. And somehow, that felt like an even greater victory than preventing a terrorist attack. 2 years after the night that changed everything, I received a call that would bring my story full circle in the most unexpected way. Cipher 7, this is Director Coleman. We have a unique situation that requires your specific expertise. But this time, there's a personal element I need to discuss with you first. I was in my Arlington apartment, reviewing case files for what I thought would be a routine week of analysis work. Director Coleman's tone suggested this wouldn't be routine at all. What kind of personal element? I asked. We've identified a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting small American communities. The operation is designed to spread confusion and discord through local social media networks, and one of the test communities appears to be Millbrook, Ohio. My hometown. Someone was targeting my father's community with the same kind of complex, multilingual psychological operations I'd spent years fighting on a national level. The campaign uses cultural manipulation techniques that require deep understanding of American regional dialects and local social dynamics, Director Coleman continued. But it's being orchestrated through coordination in multiple foreign languages. We need someone who can analyze both the linguistic sophistication and the cultural targeting. Within 6 hours, I was back in Millbrook, but this time as part of an official investigation that could potentially save my hometown from the kind of social manipulation that had destabilized communities across the globe. I set up a discreet command center in the back room of my father's hardware store. The same space where he'd stored inventory for 30 years was now housing federal intelligence equipment. This feels surreal, my father said as he watched me arrange encrypted communication systems next to boxes of screws and paint cans. 2 years ago, I thought your language skills were impractical. Now the FBI is using my store as a base of operations. Technically, Defense Intelligence Agency, I corrected, but yes, it is surreal. The investigation revealed something more sophisticated than we'd initially suspected. The disinformation campaign wasn't just targeting Millbrook. It was using small towns like ours as testing grounds for techniques that would later be deployed against larger population centers. The perpetrators had studied American regional cultures with academic precision, crafting messages that exploited specific local tensions and cultural touchstones. But their coordination communications were happening in a mixture of Russian, Chinese, and Arabic that required exactly the kind of multilingual analysis I specialized in. They're treating American communities like laboratory experiments, I explained to my father as I worked through intercepted communications. They test different psychological manipulation techniques in places like Millbrook, measure the effectiveness, then scale up the successful approaches for use in major metropolitan areas. And they picked our town because small, tight-knit community with strong local identity. High social media usage, but limited experience with sophisticated disinformation. Perfect conditions for testing how quickly false narratives can spread through trusted social networks. Over the next week, I worked with a team of analysts to trace the operation back to its source while simultaneously developing countermeasures to protect Millbrook and similar communities. The linguistic complexity was staggering. The foreign coordinators were using cultural references from Chinese classical literature to schedule timing, Russian historical metaphors to describe target demographics, and Arabic poetry structures to encode tactical instructions. But the most interesting discovery came when I realized that stopping this operation required not just linguistic analysis, but deep understanding of Millbrook's specific cultural dynamics, knowledge I'd gained simply by growing up there. You know, I told my father one evening as we closed the store together, all those years when you wanted me to focus on practical local concerns instead of abstract international studies? It turns out I needed both. Understanding Millbrook's social patterns is just as important for this investigation as understanding foreign languages. He paused in the middle of counting the day's receipts. So your hometown knowledge is actually part of your professional expertise now? Exactly. I can analyze the foreign coordination because of my language skills, but I can predict how their tactics will affect this specific community because I understand how information flows through Millbrook's social networks. Quote, the operation culminated in a community meeting that my father helped organize under the guise of discussing online safety and information literacy. I couldn't reveal the specific threats we'd identified, but I could educate the community about recognizing and resisting manipulation tactics. In our interconnected world, I told the assembled residents, small communities like ours aren't isolated from international influences. The same technologies that help us stay connected with family and friends can be exploited by people who want to divide us. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been my high school librarian, raised her hand. Sarah, are you saying that some of the controversial posts we've been seeing on the community Facebook page might not be from real local residents? I'm saying that whenever you see content designed to make you angry at your neighbors, it's worth asking who benefits from that anger. Real community discussions focus on solving problems together, not on deepening divisions. The presentation helped inoculate the community against the manipulation techniques we'd identified. But the real victory came 3 days later when we successfully traced and dismantled the entire international operation. Cipher 7, General Hayes said during the final debrief, this investigation required a unique combination of international intelligence analysis and local cultural expertise that very few people possess. Your hometown knowledge was as critical to this success as your linguistic capabilities. After the operation concluded, I stayed in Millbrook for an extra week. The first time I'd spent extended time at home purely for personal reasons since starting my intelligence career. One afternoon, I found myself helping my father reorganize inventory in the store, something I'd done countless times as a teenager but hadn't touched in years. Sarah, he said while we sorted through boxes of hardware, I've been thinking about something. When you were growing up, learning all those languages, you weren't just preparing for some abstract future career. You were developing the exact combination of skills that would eventually allow you to protect places like this. I didn't know that then, I replied. I was just following what interested me. But that's what makes it remarkable. You trusted your instincts about what was worth learning, even when the practical applications weren't obvious. Quote, we worked in comfortable silence for a while, and I reflected on how much our relationship had evolved. The father who'd once worried about my impractical language obsession was now proud of work that combined international expertise with hometown protection. Dad, can I tell you something? This investigation taught me that everything I learned, the languages, the cultural analysis, even my understanding of Millbrook's social dynamics, all of it was preparation for work I couldn't have imagined when I started. Including the criticism I gave you about being impractical? I laughed, especially that. Learning to defend my choices and explain their value, even when others didn't understand, that's been crucial for briefing skeptical officials and building support for complex investigations. That evening, we sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the neighborhood where I'd grown up. The peaceful scene felt more precious knowing that we'd successfully protected it from those who wanted to turn neighbors against each other. You know what's funny? My father said. I spent years worrying that your education was taking you away from practical concerns and local connections. But it turns out that your expertise brought you back home to protect exactly those things. As I prepared to return to Washington the next morning, my father walked me to my car, something he'd done when I was leaving for college but had stopped during the years when our relationship was strained. Sarah, I want you to know that I understand now what you meant in that graduation speech about multiple ways of understanding situations. Your work requires seeing problems from international perspectives and local perspectives simultaneously, and having the linguistic tools to analyze threats that most people never encounter directly. Exactly. You're protecting people who will never know they needed protection, using skills that took you 15 years to develop. As I drove back toward Washington, I thought about the complete transformation our relationship had undergone. The father who'd once mocked my 8 languages now understood that those same languages had enabled me to protect his hometown from international manipulation. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned that the work I'd thought was purely international actually required the local knowledge and community understanding he'd always valued. In the end, we'd both been right about what mattered. The difference was that I'd found a career that required both perspectives: international expertise and hometown heart, linguistic sophistication and cultural authenticity, global awareness and local protection. The 8 languages my father had once dismissed as impractical had become the tools that allowed me to defend everything he held dear. And somehow, that felt like the perfect ending to a story that had started with a simple love of learning different ways to say the same thing. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.